Rambam. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday? Yehud in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Guy in Ohio, Nancy, North Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Joseph in Sierra Nevada, Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Belle in Texas, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Continuing our journey through Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Our daf is page 4, Daled, daf Daled. Continue our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1, all about when an offering was brought in the Holy Temple, when it stood in Jerusalem, the procedure for bringing these offerings. And we're initially talking about what if an error was made, and at the time that the offering was slaughtered, it could be a goat, could be a sheep, could be a bull, the person who was slaughtering it had in mind a different kind of offering than was actually being brought, then it would not fulfill the obligation if the person was obligated to bring an offering. But in most cases, it would remain fit and they would finish the offering procedure. But in some cases, it would be disqualified and they couldn't even finish the procedure, like in the case of the Paschal lamb, the Pesach, right? The offering brought, or the Paschal goat, brought at Passover. Okay, we pick this up at the top of page 4a. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that we require that an offering's slaughter be performed for its own sake? You have to know that at the time you're slaughtering it, it's a sin offering or it's a burnt offering. And you have to know that it's, Joe's sin offering or Bill's burnt offering. So from where do we know this? It is derived from a verse. As the verse states, quote, and if his offering is a sacrifice, zevach, right? That's sacrifices are sometimes called korbanos, plural, korban, which is interesting. Korban really means coming near. But here we're using a different word, zevach, right? And plural zevachim, from which we get the title of our tractate. Okay. And if his offering is a sacrifice, a zevach, of peace offerings, that's a category of offerings. These are not obligatory offerings, generally. If it is a sacrifice of peace offerings, in Leviticus 3:1, and this teaches that the slaughter, zevicha, must be performed for the sake of a peace offering. Obviously, there's different types of offerings than just peace offerings, but this one is telling you that it has to be offered for a specific purpose. You have to know what kind of offering you're bringing, and then we extend that law to all offerings. And the Gemara challenges this. But perhaps when the verse states a sacrifice of peace offerings, a sacrifice of peace offerings is simply the name of this type of offering and is not referring to a person's intent at the time that he is slaughtering the offering. Remember, when you slaughter the animal, you haven't made the sacrifice yet. There's other steps that have to be done, right? The blood has to be collected in a service vessel, conveyed to the altar, its blood sprinkled on the altar. If it's a burnt offering, it gets cut up, it gets put on the altar pyre, and it burns. It's a sin offering. Most of it ends up on the altar pyre, but some of it is cut up and distributed to the priests in the temple so they can eat it. There's other steps. We're just talking about slaughter right now. The Gemara asks, we found a source for the law that slaughter must be performed for the sake of the offering that is being sacrificed. From where do we derive that the other... I'm sorry, let me just read that paragraph again. From the fact that it is written in other verses... Yeah, I skipped something. So the question was, but perhaps when the verse states a sacrifice of peace offerings, a sacrifice of peace offerings is simply the name of this type of offering and not referring to the intent of the one slaughtering it. And the Gemara answers, from the fact that it is written in other verses, who offers the blood of the peace offering, Leviticus 7:33, and who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering in Leviticus 7:14, and the term a sacrifice, zevach, is not written, whereas here in this verse the term zevach of peace offerings is written. Learn from it that the slaughter, zevicha, must be performed for the sake of a peace offering. And the Gemara asks, we found the source for the law that slaughter must be performed for the sake of the offering being sacrificed. From where do we derive that the other sacrificial rites, i.e. collecting the blood, conveying it to the altar, and sprinkling on the altar, must also be performed for the sake of the offering? You have to have the right offering in mind when you do that. And if you would say, let us derive from the fact that slaughter must be performed for the sake of the offering, therefore the other sacrificial rites in the process must also be performed for the sake of the offering as well, well, this derivation can be refuted, as slaughter has a unique element of stringency. What is unique about slaughter? It is unique in that with regard to a Pesach, right, the animal, the goat or lamb or sheep brought for Passover, the offering is disqualified if it is slaughtered not for the sake of those who eat it. If the Pesach is slaughtered for the sake of people who are incapable of eating it, such as one who is too ill to eat, it is disqualified. By contrast, performing other rites with this intent does not disqualify the offering. Won't fulfill the person's obligation, but the offering remains fit to be completed. Therefore, one cannot assume that a law that applies to slaughter applies to other rites, other stages in the ritual of bringing a sacrifice as well. So the Gemara answers, rather, how do we know that the sprinkling, conveying, etc. needs to be done for the sake of the correct offering? Rather, the verse states, who sacrifices hamakriv, the blood of the peace offering, referring to the one who collects the blood of the offering, as the Gemara will explain. And this phrase indicates that the collection of the blood must be performed for the sake of the peace offering, for the sake of a peace offering, meaning you have to know what kind of offering you're making and have that in mind when you're doing that step. But the Gemara challenges this analysis and says, and let the merciful one write this law in the Torah only with regard to the collection of the blood. And we would derive from it that slaughter must also be performed for the sake of the offering. Why do we have to have a separate proof for slaughter if we've now got a proof for collecting the blood? So the Gemara answers, because such a derivation could be refuted as follows. What is unique about collection of the blood? It is unique in that it is not valid if performed by a non-priest or a woman, whereas slaughter can be performed by any competent Jew. Interesting, right? The actual slaughter, although it's done in the precincts of the temple, does not have to be done by a priest. But collecting the blood does have to be done by a priest. Therefore, one cannot assume that a law that applies to the collection of the blood applies to the slaughter of the sacrifice as well. And the Gemara asks, we found the source for the law that slaughter and collection of the blood must be performed for the sake of the offering. From where do we derive that this law also applies to the sprinkling of the blood? Right? You slaughter the animal, collect its blood in a service vessel, convey the blood to the altar, and then the sprinkling, right? Sprinkling a few drops of that blood on the altar, the mizbeach. And if you would say, let us derive it from these other rites, i.e. the slaughter and the collection, that this law applies to the sprinkling of the blood as well, we can't rely on that. We can refute that derivation. What is unique about these rites? They are unique in that for offerings of the most sacred order, it is required that they be performed in the north of the temple courtyard. And furthermore, these rites are performed in the sacrifice of inner sin offerings, as well as standard sin offerings. The sprinkling of the blood on the external altar, by contrast, is performed in all portions of the temple courtyard, and it is not performed in the sacrifice of inner sin offerings, whose blood is sprinkled only in the sanctuary. Inner sin offerings would be like the goat of Yom Kippur or the bull of the high priest on Yom Kippur, where the sprinkling is done inside the holy temple, inside the sanctuary, and even inside the Holy of Holies, right, where only the high priest can enter, and only on Yom Kippur. So there are just a few offerings like the goat of Yom Kippur, where he's going to take the blood and sprinkle it between the staves of the ark, like the Ark of the Covenant that was housed in the Holy of Holies. So good to have this now. Thanks again, Nina, for getting this for me a few years ago. Little kit that I had to put together. It was so much fun. So this was the Temple of Solomon. And, right, I think this is Solomon's temple, or is it the second temple? Maybe it's the second temple. But here you have the outer altar, right here, if you can see that. Right? And then in here would be the sanctuary, and inside there would be the table of the showbreads and the menorah, and then deeper inside the sanctuary behind a curtain would be the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest would enter on Yom Kippur. This is the courtyard, I think, where the slaughter was done, and this is the outer courtyard where non-priests could go. Probably some slaughter was done here, but we'll get to that. And then there's other chambers, the chamber of hewn stone, etc. Right now, we're not talking about all the precincts of the Holy Temple, but it's enough to understand that there's inner, right? There are some bloods of certain sacrifices, not the sin offering or burnt offering, which are sprinkled on the outer altar here. Right, the outer altar, and you can see the steps leading up to it. There's little stairs beside the altar. These are not the steps I'm talking about, right? These are the steps that go from the outer courtyard to the inner courtyard. But there are steps over here. It's hard to see this. It's backwards for me. But the steps leading up to the outer altar. Okay. Where was I? Okay, so the point is that we can't derive the law that the sprinkling has to be done for its own sake from the fact that the collecting of the blood and the slaughter have to be done for the sake of the offering, that, for the sake of the correct offering, the one that this is being brought for. You can't make a mistake with respect to that. It's also true of the sprinkling, but we can't derive one from the other because each of these different steps in the process has its own stringencies associated with certain offerings that others don't have. Right, from where do we derive that this applies to the sprinkling as well? And if you would say, let us derive it from these rites, i.e. from the slaughter and the collection, that this law applies to the sprinkling of the blood as well, we can refute the derivation, because what is unique about these rites? They are unique in that for offerings of the most sacred order, it is required that they be performed in the north of the temple courtyard, the slaughter and the collection. And furthermore, these rites are performed in the sacrifice of inner sin offerings as well as standard sin offerings. But the sprinkling of blood on the external altar, as opposed to the inner altar is the incense altar, the gold altar that's inside the sanctuary. So by contrast, the sprinkling of the blood on the external altar is performed in all portions of the temple. Offerings whose blood is sprinkled on the outer altar can be slaughtered in all portions of the temple, not just the north here. This is the north, right? Because this is the east, facing the Mount of Olives, and this is the north, right? So there are certain offerings, like from Yom Kippur and the bull, etc., that have to be slaughtered here. But there are the most offerings don't have to be slaughtered in that location. They can be slaughtered anywhere, and then their blood sprinkled on the outer altar. The Gemara answers, so therefore we can't derive that the sprinkling has to be for its own sake from the fact that collection of the blood and slaughter have to be for their own sake, or for the sake of the correct offering. So therefore we need a different proof for the fact that the sprinkling of the blood on the outer altar has to be done for the sake of the correct offering. So, the Gemara answers, rather, the verse states, who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering in Leviticus 7:14, indicating that the sprinkling of the blood must be performed for the sake of a peace offering, for a specific correct offering. You can't make a mistake in the sprinkling, or you will disqualify the offering in terms of fulfilling the obligation of the one bringing it, though it will remain fit. The Gemara challenges, and let the merciful one write this law only with regard to sprinkling, and we would derive from it that it applies to slaughter and collection as well. In other words, why can't we derive the law that slaughter and collection have to be done for the sake of the correct offering from the fact that sprinkling has to be done for the correct offering? And the Gemara answers, no, that would not work, because such a derivation could be refuted, as sprinkling on the outer altar has a unique element of stringency. What is unique about sprinkling? It is unique in that a non-priest is liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven for performing it. Only a priest can sprinkle on the altar, and if a non-priest does it, he's chayav misa, right? He could technically be subject to a death penalty, he's chayav kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Whereas if a non-priest does the collection of the blood, which is also only priest can do it, but if a non-priest does it, he won't receive kares for that. And the Gemara asks, we found the source for the law with regard to all four rites, save conveying the blood to the altar. Slaughter, collecting the blood, and sprinkling the blood. How does the blood that the priest collects get to the altar where it is sprinkled? That's called conveying. So we found a source for this law with regard to all four rites, except for conveying the blood to the altar. From where do we derive that this rite must also be performed for the sake of the correct offering? And if you would say, let us derive from all the other rites that conveying the blood must also be performed for the sake of the offering, we can refute this. What is unique about all the other rites? They are unique in that each of them is an indispensable rite. Would you say that any requirement that applies to those rites necessarily applies also with regard to conveying the blood, which is dispensable? Dispensable. If you slaughter the blood in the outer courtyard, and if you slaughter the animal in the outer courtyard, and you collect the blood there, and the sprinkling has to be done in the inner courtyard, not the sanctuary, but the inner courtyard, right? Outer courtyard, inner courtyard. So you slaughter the animal in the outer courtyard and collect its blood there, and then you're going to sprinkle the blood on the altar that's in the inner courtyard. How are you going to get it there? Doesn't sound like it's indispensable. Answer, you don't have to slaughter the animal in the outer courtyard. You could slaughter the animal in the inner courtyard right next to the altar, and then you would collect its blood right there and boom, sprinkle it on the altar, and it wouldn't require conveying. That's why it's not indispensable. So the Gemara answers, rather, so how do we know that conveying, if it's going to be done, needs to be done with the correct intent? So rather, the verse states, and the priest shall sacrifice the whole and make it smoke upon the altar. And the master said that this is referring to conveying the limbs of the offering to the ramp of the altar. And it is taught in a baraisa with regard to the verse, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall present the blood, that this is referring to the collection of the blood. And one can infer that the merciful one expresses collection of the blood in the same language used for conveying, to tell you that you should not exclude conveying from the category of collection of the blood. Therefore, the laws of collection do apply to conveying. So the Gemara asks, okay, we found a source for the law concerning deviation with regard to the type of offering, i.e., that an offering may not be slaughtered for the sake of a different type of offering. You can't slaughter the animal, and at the time, if you're bringing a sin offering, but at the time you're slaughtering the animal, you say this is for a burnt offering. Okay, so now it's no longer gonna fulfill the owner's obligation. Again, we'll complete the process if they realize the error, and now the slaughtered animal is brought as a sin offering, the priest can eat it, the blood is accepted on the altar, etc. We finish it, but the owner who was obligated to bring a sin offering has not fulfilled his obligation. Right? That's what it means if you had the wrong intent. If you were trying to bring a Pesach, and you had the wrong intent at the time of slaughter, it becomes fully disqualified. You don't even finish the procedure, and they can't eat it. Okay, so that's deviation of the offering, meaning you had the wrong offering in mind. What about deviation of the owner? Meaning the one who slaughtered it had the correct type of offering in mind, but he thought he was doing Bill's offering when in fact it was Tom's offering, right? That's deviation with regard to the owner. So how do we know that deviation with regard to the owner also makes it disqualifies the offering? So Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Ami, says the verse states with regard to a thanks offering, a todah, and the meat of the sacrifice, zevach, of his thanksgiving peace offering shall be eaten on the day of his offering. Leviticus 7:15. Apparently indicating that its slaughter, zevicha, must be performed for the sake of a todah, a thanks offering. And if this language is not needed for the matter of deviation with regard to the type of offering, because we already derived that, and in fact it is not, as we already derived this law from there, i.e. the verse cited concerning peace offerings, therefore we apply this law now to the matter of deviation with regard to the owner. It is thereby derived that an offering must be slaughtered for the sake of its owner, right? You must have in mind the correct owner at the time that you're slaughtering the animal. So the Gemara asks, but does this verse actually come to teach this law? Isn't it necessary for that which is taught in a baraisa concerning the phrase and the meat of the sacrifice of his thanksgiving peace offering? About this, Abba Hanin says, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, it comes to teach that a thanks offering, a todah, that one slaughtered for the sake of a peace offering is a shalam, right? Or shelamin is the plural. L'shem shalamim, right? So we refer to it as the plural. That one slaughtered for the sake of a peace offering is fit, whereas a peace offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a thanks offering is unfit. And what is the difference between this offering and that offering? A thanks offering is called a peace offering in that verse, but a peace offering is not called a thanks offering. So to break that down for a second, a thanks offering, right, where you are bringing a free will offering to say thank you to the Lord, that is a type of peace offering. It is a subset of shelamin, of peace offerings. Because a todah is a subset of shelamin, a shelamin is not a subset of a todah, right? So all thanks offerings are peace offerings, but not all peace offerings are thanks offerings. I think there's an interesting spiritual lesson there, right? So anytime you express gratitude, you increase the peace. Anytime you seek to increase the peace, you have not necessarily said thank you. The Gemara answers, we are saying that it is derived from the superfluous term sacrifice, zevach, that the slaughter, zevicha, must be performed for the sake of the owner. The term peace offering teaches Abba Hanin's ruling. Therefore, it's not free for the teaching we just needed a moment ago. So the Gemara disputes this. But the term zevach is still necessary to serve as the source for another halachic teaching. From where is it derived that the meat of a sin offering and a guilt offering may be eaten only on the day that the animal is sacrificed and the following night, like a thanks offering? How do we know that? Because the verse states, and the meat of the sacrifice, the zevach, of his thanksgiving peace offering shall be eaten on the day of his offering. So the phrase teaches that not only thanks offerings, but any slaughtered offering is subject to this time limit unless the Torah specifies otherwise. Offerings are brought during the day, so you can eat it that day, and then you have the whole following night. But come dawn the next day, you're out of time, unless the Torah specifies a different time period. The Gemara answers, if that were so, i.e. if the term sacrifice indicated only that a sin offering and a guilt offering may be eaten only for the period of time for which a thanks offering may be eaten, let the verse write, and the meat of his thanksgiving peace offering sacrifice. What is indicated by the mention of the word sacrifice before the phrase his thanksgiving peace offering? Rather, you can learn two things from it. So the Gemara asks, we found a source for the law that slaughter must be performed for the sake of the owner. From where do we derive that the other sacrificial rites must also be performed, not only for the sake of the correct offering, but for the sake of the correct owner? And if you would say, let us derive from slaughter that the other rites must be performed for the sake of the owner as well, we can refute this. What is unique about slaughter? It is unique in that, with regard to the Pesach, slaughter, not for the sake of those who eat it, disqualifies the offering, whereas performing the other rites, not for the sake of the owner, does not. Again, it will take it out of the realm of fulfilling your obligation if you have to bring an offering, if it's an obligatory offering, but slaughtering it for this wrong reason or for the wrong person will leave it fit so that we would finish the rite. And if it involves eating, it could be eaten. But a Pesach that's slaughtered either not as a Pesach or for the wrong person becomes fully disqualified and it can no longer be eaten. The Gemara answers, a term of slaughter is stated with regard to deviation from the type of offering, and a term of slaughter is stated with regard to deviation with regard to the owner. So, just as concerning the term slaughter stated with regard to the deviation from the type of offering, you did not differentiate between slaughter and the other sacrificial rites, and all four rites must be performed for the sake of the offering, so too, concerning the term slaughter stated with regard to deviation in the context of the owner, you should not differentiate between slaughter and the other sacrificial rites. And the Gemara counters by saying, this derivation can be refuted. What is unique about deviation from the type of offering as opposed to deviation with regard to the owner? It is unique with regard to four matters. First, it is unique in that its disqualification concerns the essence of the offering itself. And second, it is unique in that deviation from the type of offering applies to the four sacrificial rites, whereas performing a rite for the sake of the owner is relevant only to the sprinkling of the blood, which atones for the owner. And third, it is unique in that deviation from the type of offering applies even after the death of the owner, when the owner's heir brings the offering, whereas intent for the sake of the owner is irrelevant after the owner has died. And fourth, it is unique in that deviation from the type of offering applies with regard to communal offerings as well as with regard to individual offerings, whereas employing the term owner is irrelevant with regard to communal offerings which are owned by the public, not by an owner. Now we're on page 4b, and although two of these distinctions are not precise, the other two are in any event precise distinctions based upon which a distinction can be drawn. Therefore, just because we've derived that the slaughter must be for the sake of the right type of offering, and so does the collection of the blood, the conveyance, and the sprinkling, we haven't derived that all four rites have to be for the sake of the correct owner. So the Gemara explains why two of the distinctions are not precise. What is different about deviation with regard to the owner, such that its disqualification does not concern the offering itself? It is that this merely constitutes a change of thought. Deviation from the type of offering is also merely a change of thought, the offering is not physically affected. So rather, this distinction between deviation with regard to the owner and deviation from the type of offering is false. One should claim that if deviation from the type of offering disqualifies it once the one who slaughtered it had that intent, here too, once the second distinction, the case where the owner died. And according to Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Mari, who says that disqualification by deviation with regard to the owner applies even after the owner's death, there is no distinction in this regard between deviation from the type of offering and deviation with regard to the owner. In any event, there are two remaining distinctions based on which the comparison between a deviation from the type of offering and a deviation with regard to the owner can be refuted. In other words, we haven't yet proved that deviation, having the wrong intent with respect to who owns it, disqualifies the offering. It does, we just haven't proved it yet. So, rather, Rav Ashi says that the law that it is prohibited to sprinkle the blood for the sake of one other than the actual owner is derived from a verse, not by logic, not by Kal V'chomer, not by extending from one area to another, but rather a verse, Leviticus 1:4, and it shall be accepted for him to atone for him, teaching that the sacrificial rite that atones for the owner, which is in fact the sprinkling of the blood, we slaughter the animal in order to have blood to sprinkle on the altar. Sprinkling the blood on the altar is the essential component of an offering. And the sprinkling of the blood must be performed specifically for him and not for another person. So the Gemara asks, but does this verse that you just named actually come to teach this law? Isn't that verse necessary for that which is taught in a Baraisa? With regard to the verse, and it shall be accepted for him to atone for him, alav, for him, Rabbi Shimon says this indicates that in a case where one consecrated an animal as an offering and it died or was lost, if it was initially incumbent upon him, alav, it is upon him. It's interesting the way the Hebrew works, right? When you say that you are obligated, there's different ways to say that. One way is literally obligated. Another way to say it is upon you, right? It is on you. We kind of use that in English, right? That's on me, that's on you, right? And it means that, it adheres to you, it applies to you, or you are obligated in it. So it is upon him to bring an offering, i.e., if he had accepted upon himself a personal obligation to bring an offering, he bears responsibility for it, i.e., he is obligated to bring another offering in its stead. But if it was not incumbent upon him, alav, to bring an offering, i.e., if he consecrated a specific animal without accepting upon himself any personal obligation, he does not bear responsibility for it if it dies or is lost. In other words, if a person said, and I'm speaking blinator, not making any kind of a vow, I'm just teaching. If a person said, it is incumbent on me to bring an olah, a burnt offering, also known as an elevation offering, right? And I'm designating this animal to bring. So now I've consecrated that animal. I'm going to have to take it to Jerusalem when the temple is standing and bring it as a burnt offering. But remember what I said was, it is incumbent on me to bring a burnt offering, and I designate that animal to be the burnt offering. So therefore, if something happens to that animal, it develops a blemish, it will be disqualified. It cannot be brought as an offering in the temple on the altar. So then I have to bring another animal because I have an obligation to bring a burnt offering. If that animal that I consecrated for becomes disqualified, I'm going to have to consecrate another animal for that purpose. Whereas, if my original vow or my original designation was, I designate this animal to be a burnt offering that I will bring in Jerusalem, so that animal has to be brought as a burnt offering. But if it develops a blemish and it can't be brought, okay, it can't be brought. I'm off the hook. I have no further obligation. That's the difference between obligating myself to bring a specific animal or obligating myself to bring an offering and just choosing an animal for that offering. In the second case, if that animal can't be brought, I have to bring another. Oh boy. Where was I? Goes over here. No. Right. Okay. And Rav Yitzhak bar Abdimi says, what is the reasoning behind this distinction between designating an animal or, designating that I have an obligation? Once a person said, it is incumbent upon me to bring an offering. It is considered as though the offering is loaded upon his shoulders. He does not discharge his obligation until he brings an offering. And if the first animal he designates is not, in the end you can't bring it because it develops a blemish, you're going to have to bring another animal. The Gemara answers, okay, Rav Ashi says that the law that it is prohibited to sprinkle the blood for the sake of one other than the owner is derived from the phrase, and it shall be accepted for him, and not from the phrase for him, on which the Baraisa is based. Right? So we're trying to derive what is the proof that if you have the wrong owner in mind when you slaughter, that you have disqualified, or when you have the wrong owner in mind when you sprinkle, that you have disqualified the offering and he's got to bring another. So we're using this idea of what atones for him, but which phrase in that verse is the proof for the sprinkling must be done with the correct owner in mind. So the Gemara asks, we found a source for the law that slaughter and sprinkling must be performed for the sake of the owner. From where do we derive that the collection of the blood must also be performed for the sake of the owner? And if you would say, let us derive from slaughter and sprinkling that collection must also be performed for the sake of the correct owner, we can refute this. What is unique about slaughter and sprinkling? They are unique in that each is a rite for which one is liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven, Charis, if he performs it outside the temple. Right? Once there is a temple, you can only bring sacrifices in the temple. You can't make personal altars outside the temple, as was possible at a few earlier times in history. Now there's no temple, but it remains prohibited to bring offerings at personal altars outside the temple mount. So we haven't done this since the second temple was destroyed. There have been no sacrifices in 2,000 years. Rather, Rav Ashi says that the law that the collection of the blood must also be performed for the sake of the owner is derived from the case of the ram of the Nazir, one who takes a vow of Naziris to abstain from the products of the grapevine and to grow his hair long and to not come into contact with the dead. Who's the most famous Nazir? Samson, who was a Nazir from birth. When he finishes, a normal person would have a not lifelong term of Naziris, but rather it would be, usually for 30 days. And at the completion of his term of Naziris, he has to bring certain offerings. And until he's brought them and wait for nightfall, he cannot return to consuming products from the grapevine like wine. Okay, so a Nazir has to bring certain offerings at the completion of his term of Naziris. As it is written, and he shall offer the ram for a sacrifice, Zevach, of peace offerings unto the Lord, in Numbers 6:17, indicating that its offering should be performed for the sake of a peace offering. And if the verse is not necessary for the matter of deviation from the type of offering, as we derived that from the other place earlier, apply it to the matter of deviation with regard to the owner. It is thereby derived that its sacrificial rites must be performed for the sake of its owner. Rav Acha bar Abba said to Rava in objection to this derivation, say that the term shall offer, the phrase shall offer, is a generalization and a sacrifice, Zevach, is a detail. According to the principles of biblical hermeneutics, where there is a generalization followed by a detail, the generalization includes only that which is specified in the detail. Accordingly, zevicha, yes, must be performed for the sake of its owner, but no other rite must be performed for the sake of its owner in order for the offering to remain fit. So the Gemara answers, if it had been written, shall offer the ram for peace offerings as a sacrifice, it would be as you say. And the clause, shall offer the ram for peace offerings, would be considered a generalization, and the term sacrifice, zevach, would be a detail. But that's not what's written in the Torah. Now that it is written, shall offer the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings, the term shall offer is an incomplete generalization, as the term for a sacrifice interrupts between shall offer and peace offerings. And one cannot derive a law from an incomplete generalization by employing the principle of a generalization followed by a detail. Ravina says there is a different answer. Actually, one can derive Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, but the form... We have a pause in the internet. I'm just letting it catch up. Sorry about that. I don't know why. Nothing's changed, but her internet slowed down for a moment. I think now it's back. Okay. So before Ravina concluded his interpretation, Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, but the former generalization is dissimilar to the latter generalization. The former generalization includes only the essential sacrificial actions and nothing more, whereas the latter generalization includes any sacrificial duty unto the Lord, and even pouring the remains of the blood on the base of the altar and burning the sacrificial portions of the offering on the altar would be included in this. And Ravina responded, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught generalizations and details in cases like this. So Ravina now concludes his explanation, and he says, since the term unto the Lord is another generalization, the verse is formulated as a generalization, a detail, and a generalization. And you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. So just as the mentioned detail, slaughter, is defined as an essential rite, and we require that it be performed for the sake of the owner, so too we require that every essential rite be performed for the sake of the owner. What are the essential rites? Slaughter, and collection of the blood, and sprinkling. But conveyance was not essential. Now the Gemara asks, if the verse is referring only to actions similar to the detail, not all of the essential rites are necessarily included. Perhaps it should be derived that just as the mentioned detailed slaughter is defined as an essential rite and one is liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven for performing it outside of the temple, so too any essential rite for which one is liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven for performing it outside the temple is included in the verse. So accordingly, slaughter and sprinkling the blood are included, but collection of the blood and conveying are not. Alternatively, it could be derived that, just as the item mentioned in the detail is clearly defined as an action that requires a performance in the north of the temple courtyard, special, only certain offerings have that requirement, and is performed in the sacrifice of the inner sin offerings, like the bull of Yom Kippur, so too any rite that requires performance in the north and is performed in the sacrifice of inner sin offerings is included in the law. Accordingly, slaughter and collection are included, but sprinkling, which applies to all offerings, which applies to offerings that are not all the offerings except the inner offerings, would therefore not be included, and therefore we have not proved that sprinkling has to be done for the sake of the correct owner. So the Gemara answers, both possibilities are equally valid. This derivation can be said, and that derivation can be said. Either collection or sprinkling might be included in the law. Consequently, they are equal, and therefore both are included. Or, according to another version of the Gemara's answer, they are equal, and therefore each one, i.e. both collection and sprinkling, shall stand in its status. And the Gemara provides an alternative answer. If you wish, say instead that sprinkling is derived from the verse that Rav Ashi cited, and it shall be accepted for him to atone for him. Therefore, when the verse states, and he shall offer the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings unto the Lord, indicating that the inclusion of rites similar to slaughter, it is apparently referring not to sprinkling, but to collection. And the Gemara asks, we found the source for the law that the ram of a Nazir, the offering he brings at the end of his period of Naziris, must be sacrificed for the sake of its owner, right? If he brought that ram so that he could end his Naziris, but the person who slaughtered it had in mind, the mistake that, this guy brought it as a sin offering, not as the ram of Naziris, or, now we're talking about the Nazir brought it, but this guy thought it was a different person who's ending his Naziris, and that's the ram, so the ram was slaughtered for the sake of the wrong owner. From where do we derive that this law applies with regard to other peace offerings as well? We know it works for Nazir, that it has to be done for the correct owner, but how do we extend that to other peace offerings? And if you would say, let us derive from the ram of a Nazir that all peace offerings must be sacrificed for the sake of their owners, we can refute this. What is unique about the ram of the Nazir? It is unique in that there is other blood, i.e. there are other offerings. When a Nazir finishes his Naziris, he has to bring a peace offering and a sin offering and a guilt offering. And a burnt offering. Together with his ram of a peace offering. Why does a Nazir bring a sin offering? We talked about this in the tractate Naziris. Because he shouldn't have made that vow, right? He made something prohibited to him that Hashem permitted to him. This is an interpretation that's not spelled out in the Torah. But I forget who it was. Maybe Rabbi Shimon said that. Or one of the sages said that. So the Gemara answers, if that is so. So the point is, what is unique about the peace offering of a Nazir is that it has to be accompanied by a sin offering and a burnt offering. Other peace offerings don't have to be accompanied by those kinds of offerings. So the Gemara answers, if that is so, if this law is unique to the ram of the Nazir, let the verse write his peace offerings, shalama, right? Peace offerings to him. What is indicated by writing peace offerings without the his, shelamin? It is written to include all types of peace offerings. So the Gemara asks, we found the source for the law that a peace offering must be sacrificed for its own sake and for the sake of its owner. From where do we derive that this law applies with regard to all other offerings, not just peace offerings? We know already that we can extend that teaching to all offerings with regard to, it has to be brought for the sake of the correct offering. How do we know we can extend that to the law that all offerings have to be brought for the sake of the correct owner? And if you would say, let us derive from a peace offering that all offerings must be sacrificed with these intentions, we can refute that by saying, what is unique about a peace offering? It is unique in that it requires semicha. What is semicha? That the owner places his hands on the animal before it is slaughtered. If he doesn't do that, the offering is not disqualified, but it is a requirement of the peace offering. So what is unique about the peace offering? It requires semicha. And also it is accompanied by libations. And it requires the waving of the breast and the right hind leg by the priest and the owner together. No other offering possesses all three of these requirements, only peace offerings. So the Gemara answers, rather the verse states, this is the law of the burnt offering, of the meal offering, and of the sin offering, and of the guilt offering, and of the consecration offering, and of the sacrifice of peace offerings in Leviticus 7:37. Now all the offerings are tied together. The verse juxtaposes all types of offerings with peace offerings, indicating that just as we require the sacrifice of a peace offering be performed for its sake, both concerning the type of offering and the identity of its owner, So too, we require the sacrifice of every type of offering to be performed for its sake, both concerning the type of offering and the owner. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Having established the source for the requirement to sacrifice offerings with the rightful owner and the specific type of offering in mind, the Gemara asks a new question. Why not say that in a case where one slaughtered them not for their sake, they are disqualified? Why, according to our Mishnah, do they remain fit? Again, if you offer it for the wrong type of offering or for the wrong owner, if it was a sin offering, it will not atone for him. He's going to have to bring a different animal as a sin offering. But we do complete the process. That's what it means that it remains fit. So the question is why? If it was brought for the wrong owner or for the wrong type of offering, why didn't we just cut it off? So the Gemara answers, the verse states, that which has gone out of your lips you shall observe and do according to what you have vowed freely to the Lord your God, that which you have promised with your mouth in Deuteronomy 23:24. So the Gemara interprets the words nedarta, vowed, and freely, nedava, exegetically. We interpret these words. How can the offering mentioned in this verse be a gift offering, nedava? It is already referred to as a vow offering, neder. Rather, the verse indicates that if you did what you had vowed to do, i.e. you sacrificed your vow offering properly, then it shall be a satisfactory vow offering. And if it, so in other words, you will have completed the task you set out to do. Either you vowed to bring a burnt offering, and now you will have fulfilled your vow. Or you are obligated to bring a sin offering, and now you have fulfilled your obligation. Whereas, if it was slaughtered for the wrong type of offering, or on behalf of the wrong owner, you have not fulfilled your vow to bring a burnt offering, or you have not fulfilled your obligation to bring a sin offering. So if you do it correctly, it shall be satisfactory for your vow. But if you did not sacrifice it properly, it shall be rendered a voluntary gift. You finish the process because you started it. You made a mistake, but you finish it. But what are you finishing? Bringing a gift offering to the Lord, not what you originally vowed to do. And it was necessary for the Torah to include the verse, that which has gone out of your lips, and it was necessary to include the verse, this is the law. As had the merciful one written in the Torah only the verse, that which has gone out of your lips, I would say that we do not know what requirement does not disqualify the offering if not fulfilled. Therefore, the merciful one writes, this is the law, juxtaposing all offerings with a peace offering, which must be performed for its own sake. And if the merciful one had written only the verse, this is the law, I would say that offerings sacrificed not for their sake should be disqualified entirely. Therefore, the merciful one writes, that which has gone out of your lips, teaching that they are accepted, though they do not satisfy the owner's obligation. That's where we'll stop at the top of page 5a and take some questions. Regarding the model of the temple, Camille says, which one is the kotel, or some would pronounce it kosel, today? Great question. Right? I showed you this model of the temple. Okay. And you're asking, what's the western wall where Jews go, and not just Jews, but people go to pray, the holiest site in Judaism, some would say the holiest place in the world, the western wall in Jerusalem, right, in the Kotel Plaza. How does that relate to the temple? Here's the answer. We'll use my book as the wall. Right? If we imagine, that seems disrespectful. Here we go. Imagine that this is the wall and people pray down here. The temple would be up there. So you can see it. There. Right? So if people are praying at the wall down here, The temple would be up here, because this wall where we pray is the outer wall of the Temple Mount, or the retaining wall. It's all that's left, right? Built by Herod late in the Second Temple period. It's down here, right? Then there's the Temple Mount, right? When you look up at the Kotel, right? It's a pretty tall wall. And then up there, Temple Mount, and then, kind of more inbound, more, further in than the edge of that wall, the edge of the Temple Mount, is where the temple would be, up there. Sadly, now there is a different building from a different religion that has a very tenuous connection. Let's just call it what it is, right? Islam, which is a religion that was born way late in Jewish history. Jewish history is over 3,000 years old, 3,700 years. Islam was born around the year 600 something, right? So it's only 1,400 years ago. And then, through warfare and proselytizing, etc., spread out over a huge area, but conversion by the sword, very common practice, and colonized huge areas, including the Holy Land, in the post Second Temple period, right after the destruction. And so the Holy Land was colonized by many empires. One of them was the Muslim Empire, the Caliphate. And then they built, I believe it's called the Dome of the Rock, approximately where the Holy Temple would be. Not exactly, but approximately. And, they staked their claim there. And, Muhammad, they say, went there in a dream, but not in real life. And now Jews cannot even pray on the Temple Mount. It's not right. It's just not right. But at any rate, we respect other religions, and we allow, and we encourage Christians to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Muslims are welcome to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or do whatever they do in the Dome of the Rock, which are both on the Temple Mount. But Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, where our temple was, because it's considered inflammatory. Now, there are restrictions for religious Jews to be on the Temple Mount, right? There's only certain areas where, by Torah law, we could walk, because we don't want to walk over where the temple was, lest we commit a sacrilege, right? But there are people who are well educated and well versed in this law, and so there are areas of the Temple Mount which would still be okay for religious Jews to be up there, and then we would like to just say our daily prayers, for example, and this is considered inflammatory and is prohibited not by religious law but by secular law. As you can hear in my voice, there's a lot of issues involved here. We'll let it go at that. Ilanit, very cool model. Do you also have the third temple? I believe it is available based on Ezekiel's dimensions. Yes, I don't have that, but I should get it. It's pretty cool. And Tom says, with regard to this idea that all thanks offerings are peace offerings, but not all peace offerings are thanks offerings, Tom says being thankful induces a peaceful state of mind. Amen. Amen. Thank God we've had this time together. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. But this week we will not have a Saturday night class, as I mentioned. So we'll have class tomorrow, Friday, and then Sunday at the regular Sunday time. All the best.